You remember those potatoes. Heavy, dense, earth-scented. When you cut them open, the flesh was firm and creamy. When they boiled, they didn't fall apart into water. When you baked them, the inside turned fluffy but rich, almost buttery, without adding anything. In the 1980s, potatoes weren't grown for appearance. They were grown for winter. Families planted them because they needed food that would last 6 months in a cellar. And when food security depends on one crop, you grow it differently. Back then, soil wasn't treated as a surface you plant into. It was treated as something alive. Autumn preparation mattered more than spring planting. After harvest, people didn't leave garden beds empty. They layered them with what they had: aged manure from chickens or rabbits, fallen leaves, straw bedding, composted kitchen scraps. In rural areas across Europe and North America, wood stoves burned all winter, and ash was collected in metal buckets instead of thrown away. That ash eventually returned to the soil. Winter snow and rain pressed everything down. Microorganisms broke it apart slowly. Worms moved through it. By spring, the soil wasn't just dirt. It was dark, soft, and deep. Potatoes love depth. And that's another difference. They were planted deeper than most people plant them today. The soil was loosened well below the surface, sometimes nearly a foot deep if the ground allowed it. The seed potatoes were placed lower than modern recommendations suggest. Not shallow, not barely covered, properly buried in loose earth. Large seed potatoes were often cut into pieces. Each piece carried 1 or 2 strong eyes. They were left out for a day or two before planting, allowing the cut surface to dry and form a protective skin. This wasn't considered risky. It was practical. One large potato became 3 or 4 plants. Spacing was wider too. Not because people followed a chart, but because they knew crowded plants compete. Rows were straight, often measured by eye, but generous. When the green shoots emerged and reached several inches tall, soil was pulled up around them. Not once, repeatedly. Throughout the season, gardeners walked their rows with a hoe and built ridges around each plant. Every time the stems grew taller, more soil was added. The base of each plant slowly became a mound. This mattered. Potatoes form along buried stems. The more stem covered with soil, the more room the plant has to produce tubers. By mid-season, rows sometimes looked like long raised banks of earth. It required labor. But labor was normal. Watering was deliberate. There were no automatic timers. Water came from wells, hoses, sometimes buckets. Because it took effort, watering was deep but not constant. Soil was soaked thoroughly and then left alone. This encouraged roots to grow downward rather than staying near the surface. Shallow roots produce smaller yields. Deep roots find more nutrients. Wood ash was used carefully, a light scattering along rows before rain, not dumped in piles, just enough to add potassium, which potatoes demand in large quantities. Too much would damage soil balance, so it was applied with familiarity, not formulas. Rotation was routine. Nobody planted potatoes in the same spot year after year. They moved them. One year in this bed, the next year somewhere else. Beans or cabbage might follow potatoes. The soil was allowed to shift and recover naturally. Seed selection also mattered. Families didn't buy random bags each year. They saved their best potatoes from harvest, medium-sized, healthy, disease-free tubers, and stored them separately for planting the next spring. Over time, this selected for plants adapted to their specific soil and climate. The result wasn't flashy. It was steady improvement. And when harvest time came, the digging itself was careful. Forks went deep. Soil was lifted gently. Potatoes came out thick-skinned and solid. They weren't washed immediately. They were cured, laid out in shade for several days so skins toughened before storage, because storage mattered. These potatoes weren't meant for a week. They were meant for months. And when you grow something with winter in mind, you grow it differently. Not faster, not easier, but deeper. The varieties were different too. In the 1980s, most families weren't chasing the newest hybrid, promising uniform size or supermarket appearance. They planted what worked locally, what stored well, what survived their soil. In many parts of Europe, that meant firm, late-season varieties bred for storage rather than fast turnover. In North America, many families still planted older, open-pollinated or long-established cultivars that had been circulating for decades. They weren't always perfectly round, they weren't always identical, but they were reliable. And reliability matters more than perfection. Modern commercial potatoes are often selected for shipping durability, appearance, and rapid growth cycles. In the 1980s, backyard growers selected for density, flavor, and storage life. Those traits don't always look impressive on a shelf, but they matter in a cellar. Another difference was time. Potatoes were allowed to mature fully. Today, many gardeners harvest early. New potatoes, tender skins, quick turnover. Back then, early harvest happened only if necessary. Otherwise, plants were left until vines naturally died back. That natural dieback signaled full energy transfer into the tubers. Skins thickened, starch content increased, size reached its maximum. When you pull a plant early, you sacrifice weight. They understood that instinctively. Fertilizer use was also slower and steadier. Instead of high nitrogen bursts early in the season, nutrients were built gradually into soil months before planting. Too much nitrogen creates lush green tops but smaller tubers. Many modern gardeners unknowingly overfeed the foliage. In the 1980s, nitrogen came from compost and manure that had aged through winter. It released slowly, balanced. The plant grew strong but didn't become top-heavy at the expense of underground production. Weed control was constant, but simple. Rows were hoed regularly, not aggressively torn apart, but gently maintained. Weeds were removed early before competition started. This kept nutrients available for potatoes. It also loosened the soil surface, improving oxygen flow to roots. That loose surface layer matters more than people realize. Compacted soil limits tuber expansion. Potatoes physically need room to swell. In gardens that were walked on or left unworked, tubers stayed smaller. And then, there's something rarely mentioned today: patience during storage preparation. After harvest, potatoes weren't rushed into bright kitchens or washed under hoses. They were brushed clean. Dirt left on them helped protect skin. They were cured in a cool, shaded place for several days so minor cuts could heal. Only after curing were they moved into storage boxes, wooden crates, often layered with newspaper or straw. Cellars were dark, cool, dry, but not arid. Temperature stability kept potatoes from sprouting too early, and because families depended on them, storage conditions were monitored. A spoiled crate meant real loss. This constant attention shaped how potatoes were grown. You don't cut corners on something you need for winter. Another quiet factor was community knowledge. People shared experience. If someone noticed smaller harvests one year, neighbors compared practices. They observed weather patterns, soil changes, disease signs. Knowledge wasn't extracted from search engines. It was accumulated over seasons. When blight appeared, infected plants were removed quickly. When drought threatened, watering schedules adjusted. The system was flexible but grounded in observation. Modern gardening often relies on packaged solutions. Back then, solutions were incremental adjustments based on what worked the year before. And taste, that's something many people remember. Older varieties grown in mineral-rich soil, matured fully, and stored properly develop higher dry matter content. That translates to better texture and deeper flavor. Many modern varieties prioritize appearance and rapid yield over flavor complexity. When you grow for family rather than market shelves, flavor matters again. And perhaps the most overlooked difference wasn't technique at all. It was scale. Backyard gardens in the 1980s weren't decorative patches. They were larger than most modern suburban gardens. Entire sections of yard were dedicated to staples: potatoes, cabbage, beans, carrots. That scale allowed proper rotation and reduced nutrient depletion. Today, many people try to grow potatoes in small raised beds that are reused for the same crops repeatedly. Soil fatigue builds, nutrient balance shifts, yields decline quietly. In the 1980s, even small properties often dedicated significant ground space to staple crops. It wasn't about variety, it was about volume. And when you give potatoes space, real space, they respond. What changed over time wasn't the biology of potatoes, it was our priorities. Convenience replaced preparation. Speed replaced patience. Appearance replaced storage weight. The methods that made potatoes large weren't mysterious. They were consistent. They required planning months ahead. They required soil building rather than quick feeding. They required deep planting, repeated hilling, proper spacing, mature harvesting, and careful storage. None of that is complicated. It just isn't fashionable. Nothing about those gardens was revolutionary. There were no secret formulas, no miracle additives, no branded systems promising record yields. Just soil that had been cared for long before planting day. Seed potatoes selected from the strongest harvest the year before. Rows measured with habit rather than rulers. Hands that understood when soil was ready simply by how it felt. And most importantly, time. Time to prepare the ground in autumn. Time to let compost mature. Time to allow plants to finish their full life cycle before digging them up. Time to cure and store properly. In the 1980s, potatoes weren't grown as a hobby experiment. They were grown as insurance. They filled wooden crates stacked against cellar walls. They sat under burlap in cool basements. They were counted, checked, protected from frost and rot. A good harvest meant security. A poor harvest meant worry. That kind of pressure creates discipline. It forces better methods. The soil was rotated because it had to be. Ash was saved because nothing was wasted. Manure was aged because people understood fresh manure burned roots. Water was used carefully because it required effort to carry. Every step had intention behind it. Today, most of the biological principles are the same. Potatoes still respond to deep, loose soil. They still produce more tubers along buried stems. They still require potassium for size. They still reward patience at harvest. What's different now is the environment around gardening. We have faster varieties, pre-packaged fertilizers, compact raised beds, decorative layouts, quick harvest culture, social media showing early success instead of long-term storage planning. But the plant hasn't changed. If you loosen soil deeply, if you build it months before planting, if you plant deep, if you hill repeatedly, if you rotate carefully, if you let the vines die naturally before digging, if you cure before storing, you will see the difference. Not because it's a trick from the past, but because it's how potatoes naturally want to grow. Many people say vegetables tasted better decades ago. Part of that memory may be nostalgia, but part of it is density. Part of it is mineral balance. Part of it is maturity. When tubers grow slowly in rich, living soil and reach full size before harvest, they develop structure, texture, flavor. And when you grow something with winter in mind instead of a weekend meal, your priorities shift. The forgotten method of the 1980s wasn't dramatic. It was steady. It required effort, yes, but not complexity. It required patience, not technology. It required observation, not constant intervention. And that's what made potatoes heavy in your hands. Not magic, not luck, just a deeper relationship with soil. If you decide to try it this season, don't think of it as going backward. Think of it as removing the unnecessary layers that accumulated over time. Potatoes haven't forgotten how to grow large. We simply stopped giving them the conditions that once made it normal. And when you dig your first plant this year and lift a tuber that feels dense, solid, substantial, you'll understand why those old gardens filled cellars so reliably. Some methods fade from conversation, but the soil remembers.